Every person walking past a homeless man has wondered what brought him to the streets. Every community has someone they've forgotten, someone whose story they think they know. In Pine Ridge, Montana, that man is 58-year-old Vince Murphy, weathered, invisible, living in the shadows with only his loyal puppy Buck for company. For nearly 10 years, this small town has looked right through him. But on one bitter February night, when Officer Sarah Chen lies bleeding in the snow after being ambushed on a lonely mountain road, everything changes. What Vince does next will shake this town to its core and force everyone to question what they think they know about second chances. Using nothing but his bare hands and long-buried skills, he fights to save a life while his own tragic past emerges. From the darkness, what secrets was this forgotten man carrying all along? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first thing you learn about being homeless is how to become invisible. Vince Murphy had mastered this art over 9 years, 8 months, and 14 days of living in the shadows of Pine Ridge, Montana. At 58, his weathered face told stories the town refused to read, lines carved by mountain winters and the kind of pain that settles deep in a man's bones. His shelter sat tucked beneath a canopy of pine trees on the outskirts of town, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Constructed from salvaged tarps, discarded lumber, and the careful engineering of necessity, it kept out the worst of Montana's bite. Inside, everything had its place. A Coleman lantern that still worked, blankets arranged by warmth, and a small wooden box containing items he couldn't bear to throw away. Buck, a scrappy terrier mix with one torn ear and intelligent brown eyes, had found Vince 3 winters ago. Or perhaps Vince had found Buck. Neither could remember exactly how their partnership began, only that it had saved them both. The dog possessed an uncanny ability to sense trouble, weather changes, and the rare occasions when someone approached with genuine kindness rather than suspicion. Every morning began the same way. Vince would wake before dawn, assess the weather, and plan their route through town. They moved like ghosts through Pine Ridge's streets, collecting discarded bottles, searching for odd jobs, and accepting the occasional handout from the few residents who acknowledged their existence. Most people looked through them as if they were part of the landscape, as permanent and unremarkable as the mountains themselves. Mrs. Henderson at the bakery sometimes left day-old bread in a clean bag by her back door. She never spoke to Vince directly, but the gesture carried more dignity than most charity. Tom Brennan, who ran the hardware store, would occasionally ask Vince to sweep his sidewalk in exchange for a few dollars and a cup of coffee. These small kindnesses kept them alive, but they also kept them at arm's length from the community they once called home. The town treated Vince like a problem to be managed rather than a person to be known. Children were hurried past him with whispered warnings. Shop owners watched him carefully, ready to ask him to move along if he lingered too long. The police, all 3 officers in Pine Ridge, knew him by sight, but had never bothered to learn his story. To them, he was simply the homeless guy with the dog. What they didn't see were the moments when Vince's hands moved with practiced precision, checking Buck's paws for ice damage with the gentle thoroughness of someone trained in emergency care. They didn't notice how he could predict weather changes hours before the sky showed signs, or how he positioned their camp to catch morning sun while avoiding the worst wind. They certainly didn't see the nights when he woke from nightmares, clutching a tarnished EMT badge hidden in his wooden box. A reminder of the man he used to be. Vince possessed knowledge that surprised even himself sometimes. He knew which berries were safe to eat, how to start a fire in wet conditions, and how to treat a dozen different injuries with materials found in any dumpster. He understood hypothermia, frostbite, and dehydration not from textbooks, but from living through them. When Buck had eaten something poisonous 2 years ago, Vince had saved the dog's life using techniques he remembered from another lifetime. The wilderness had become his home in ways the town never could. He knew every game trail within 5 miles, could identify birds by their calls, and understood the subtle signs that meant a storm was coming. Buck had learned to trust Vince's instincts completely, following without question when the man suddenly changed direction or quickened their pace. Their daily routine rarely varied. Morning meant checking their snares. Vince was careful to hunt only what they needed and only where it was legal. Afternoon brought their cautious journey into town for supplies and work. Evening was for maintenance, repairing their shelter, tending to their clothes, and planning for tomorrow's survival. But it was the nights that revealed Vince's true nature. When Buck curled against his side for warmth, Vince would sometimes speak quietly about things he remembered, not the tragedy that had brought him here, but the smaller moments that had made life worth living, the way his wife Sarah used to hum while cooking breakfast, how his daughter Emma had insisted on bandaging every one of Buck's imaginary injuries during their brief time together before the accident. His voice would carry knowledge of love and loss that no amount of hardship could erase. The town saw only his raggedness, the beard that needed trimming, the layers of worn clothing, the careful way he counted coins before making any purchase. They missed the intelligence in his eyes, the gentle way he spoke to Buck, and the quiet dignity he maintained, despite their judgment. They saw a failure where there walked a man who had simply been broken by circumstances beyond his control. Pine Ridge's winter was particularly harsh that year. Snow had fallen early and often, blanketing the mountains in a white silence that muffled sound and made every step deliberate. Vince had prepared well. Their shelter was reinforced, their food stores adequate, and Buck's coat had grown thick, enough to handle the cold. They had survived worse winters with less preparation. What Vince couldn't prepare for was the night that would change everything. February had been brutal, with temperatures dropping below zero for weeks at a time. The roads outside town became treacherous, covered in black ice that even the most careful drivers struggled to navigate. It was the kind of night when smart people stayed home, when the cold could kill the unprepared in less than an hour. But Vince and Buck were not unprepared. They understood cold the way most people understood comfort. They had learned to read its moods, respect its power, and survive its cruelest intentions. On this particular night, as wind howled through the pines and snow fell like a curtain across the landscape, they were simply doing what they always did, surviving one more day in a world that had forgotten they existed. Neither of them expected to stumble upon a scene that would thrust them from the shadows into a light they had spent nearly a decade avoiding. The storm had been building all day, and by evening it painted the mountain roads in thick, treacherous sheets of ice. Vince and Buck were returning from their evening check of the snares when Buck suddenly stopped, his body going rigid in that particular way that meant danger. "What is it, boy?" Vince whispered, though he had already begun scanning the tree line. With the careful attention of someone who had learned to trust his companion's instincts completely, Buck's nose worked the air, and then he was moving, not with his usual careful pace, but with urgent purpose toward the main road that wound its way up the mountain. Vince followed, his boots crunching through snow that was already ankle-deep and getting deeper. They found her about 50 yards from where the road curved around a stand of Douglas fir. Officer Sarah Chen lay motionless in the snow, her dark uniform stark against the white ground. Blood had pooled beneath her head, already beginning to freeze in the bitter cold. Her patrol car sat 20 feet away, its driver's door open, engine still running, headlights cutting through the falling snow. Vince's training kicked in before his mind could fully process what he was seeing. In one fluid motion he was beside her, his weathered hands moving with the precision of someone who had done this countless times before. Primary assessment. Airway, breathing, circulation. She was breathing, but shallow and irregular. Pulse was weak but present, head trauma, obvious from the blood and the unnatural angle of her neck. "Jesus, what happened to you?" he muttered, his hands already moving to assess the damage. The scene told its own story. Chen's service weapon lay in the snow 3 feet from her body. The patrol car's radio crackled with static, but no one was answering the periodic check-ins from dispatch. Most telling were the tire tracks in the snow, 2 sets leading up to where Chen's car had stopped, then 1 set leading away. This wasn't an accident. Vince's mind raced through possibilities and priorities. Chen had been hit in the head with something heavy. The pattern of blood suggested a blunt object rather than a fall. The cold was working against them both now. She was losing body heat fast, and shock would set in soon if it hadn't already. He needed to stop the bleeding, keep her warm, and get help. In that order. Working quickly but carefully, Vince removed his outer coat and wrapped it around Chen's torso. The head wound was ugly, but not as bad as it had first appeared. Scalp wounds always bled dramatically. He used his scarf to apply pressure to the worst of it, then positioned her head to keep her airway clear. "Buck," he called softly, and the dog immediately appeared at his side. "I need you to do something important." Vince tore a strip of fabric from Chen's uniform sleeve, enough to carry her scent, but not enough to compromise her warmth. He held it to Buck's nose, then pointed. "Toward town. Find help. Go to town and find someone, anyone who'll listen." Buck took the fabric in his mouth and looked at Vince with those intelligent brown eyes, understanding passing between them like it had so many times before. Then the dog was gone, disappearing into the snow toward the distant lights of Pine Ridge. Alone with the unconscious officer, Vince continued his assessment. Chen was young, maybe 30, with the kind of lean strength that came from taking the job seriously. Her uniform was crisp, her boots well-maintained. Everything about her spoke of competence and care, which made her current situation all the more troubling. The radio crackled again. "Unit 7, please respond. Sarah, you missed your check-in." Vince looked at the radio, then at Chen's unconscious form. He could answer, should answer, but that would mean revealing himself, stepping out of the shadows he had inhabited for nearly a decade. It would mean questions, attention, and all the things he had been avoiding since his world fell apart. Chen moaned softly, and the decision was made for him. He crawled to the patrol car and grabbed the radio mic. This is someone who..." "Found Officer Chen. She's injured and unconscious on Mountain Road, about 2 miles up from the main intersection. She needs immediate medical attention." The dispatcher's voice came back sharp and focused. "Who is this? What's your location exactly?" "Just get an ambulance up here, head trauma, probable concussion, hypothermia setting in, and send backup. This wasn't an accident." Before the dispatcher could respond with more questions, Vince dropped the mic and returned to Chen. He checked her pulse again, still weak but steady. Her breathing had stabilized somewhat, but she was shivering now, which was actually a good sign. It meant her body was still fighting. The wind picked up, driving snow sideways across the road. Vince positioned himself between Chen and the worst of it, using his own body as a windbreak. His hands were going numb, but he kept checking her pulse, monitoring her breathing, talking to her even though she couldn't hear him. "You're going to be okay," he told her, the words forming clouds in the frigid air. "Help's coming. Just hold on." As he waited, Vince studied the scene more carefully. The tire tracks suggested someone had been waiting for Chen. This stretch of road was isolated enough that encountering another vehicle by chance would be unlikely, especially in this weather. Someone had known she would be here, had known she would be alone. Chen's equipment belt was intact, her weapon unfired. Whatever had happened had been quick and unexpected, professional even. The kind of thing that spoke to planning and intimate knowledge of her patrol routes. 15 minutes passed before Vince heard the distant wail of sirens. Buck would have reached town by now, would have found someone willing to follow a strange dog carrying a piece of police uniform. The thought of his companion navigating the storm alone tightened something in Vince's chest. But Buck was resourceful. He would find help. The ambulance arrived first, followed closely by Sheriff Coleman's truck and another patrol car. Red and blue lights painted the falling snow in colors that seemed too bright for the wilderness setting. Vince remained where he was, sheltering Chen, until the paramedics were close enough to take over. "Sir, we need you to step back," one of the EMTs called out as they approached with their equipment. Vince moved aside, watching as they took over Chen's care with the efficiency he remembered from his own days in emergency medicine. They worked quickly. Vital signs, IV, spine board, the whole routine that had once been as natural to him as breathing. Sheriff Coleman approached, his weathered face grim in the ambulance lights. "You the one who found her?" "Yes." "You make the radio call?" "Yes." Coleman studied Vince's face, recognition dawning slowly. "I know you. You're the homeless fellow. Been living out here for what, 8, 9 years? Something like that. What were you doing out here tonight?" Before Vince could answer, Buck appeared at the edge of the light, the torn fabric still in his mouth. The dog approached cautiously, clearly uncomfortable with all the people and vehicles, but determined to return to Vince's side. "Smart dog," Coleman observed. "He's the one who got help?" Vince nodded. "Sent him to town with a piece of her uniform. Figured someone would follow him." One of the paramedics looked up from Chen's stretcher. "Good thinking. Another 20 minutes in this cold and we might have lost her. You probably saved her life." As they loaded Chen into the ambulance, she stirred slightly, her eyes opening just enough to focus on Vince's face. For a moment, their eyes met, his weathered and cautious, hers glazed but aware. Then the ambulance doors closed, and she was gone, sirens fading into the storm. Sheriff Coleman turned back to Vince. "I'm going to need a statement. What you saw, what you did, everything." Vince looked down at Buck, who had dropped the fabric and was now pressed against his leg, seeking warmth and reassurance. The dog was shivering, his coat soaked through with snow and ice. "Can we do this somewhere warm?" Vince asked. "My dog's been out in this storm for an hour." For the first time in years, someone in authority was looking at Vince Murphy not as a problem to be moved along, but as a person who had just done something extraordinary. It was a feeling he had almost forgotten, the simple recognition of being useful, of mattering. But as the sheriff nodded and gestured toward his truck, Vince couldn't shake the feeling that his days of invisibility were over, for better or worse. The sheriff's truck was warm, but Vince felt exposed under the dome light as Coleman asked his questions. Buck sat pressed against his leg, still shivering despite the heat blowing from the vents. The dog's wet fur was beginning to steam, filling the cab with the smell of damp animal and anxiety. "So you just happened to be walking past when you found her?" Coleman asked, his pen poised over a small notebook. "We were checking our snares." Buck caught her scent first. Coleman glanced at the dog. "Good thing." Another hour, and the cold would have finished what whoever did this started. Through the windshield, Vince watched the crime scene team work. They photographed the tire tracks, collected evidence, and measured distances with the methodical precision of people who understood that every detail mattered. Red flares marked the spot where Chen had fallen, their glow creating an eerie circle in the falling snow. "You notice anything else? Other vehicles, people, anything that seemed out of place?" Vince described the tire tracks, the positioning of Chen's weapon, the way her equipment belt had remained intact. Coleman wrote it all down, occasionally glancing up with an expression that suggested he was re-evaluating everything he thought he knew about the homeless man in his passenger seat. "You seem to know something about this kind of thing," Coleman observed. "I've seen injuries before. What kind of work did you used to do?" The question hung in the air between them. Vince could feel himself approaching the edge of a cliff he had been avoiding for nearly 10 years. One honest answer would lead to another and another, until all the carefully constructed walls he had built around his past came tumbling down. "Different things," he said finally. Coleman didn't push, but his expression suggested the conversation wasn't over. "We're going to need you to come to the station tomorrow, give a formal statement." And someone from the prosecutor's office will probably want to talk to you too. The idea of walking into the Pine Ridge police station, of sitting in bright lights while strangers asked him questions about who he was and where he came from, made Vince's chest tighten. Buck seemed to sense his distress, pressing closer against his leg. "I don't have a phone," Vince said. "If you need me, I'll be at my camp." "Actually," Coleman said, closing his notebook, "there's something else. The hospital wants to talk to you about what you did for Officer Chen. Dr. Martinez said your first aid probably made the difference between life and death." Pine Ridge General was a small hospital, the kind that served rural communities with competence rather than glamour. Vince hadn't been inside a hospital since the night his world ended, and walking through the automatic doors felt like stepping into a previous life. Dr. Martinez was a woman in her 40s with the kind of steady presence that put people at ease. She found Vince in the waiting room, Buck curled at his feet on a blanket someone had provided. "Mr. Murphy, I'm Dr. Martinez. I wanted to thank you personally for what you did tonight." "How is she?" "Stable. Concussion, some hypothermia, but she's going to be fine. Your quick thinking with the head wound and body positioning, that made all the difference." Vince nodded, unsure how to respond to praise he wasn't used to receiving. "Where did you learn first aid like that?" Dr. Martinez asked gently. Again, the cliff edge, here and there, but Martinez was persistent in the way of medical professionals who had learned to ask the right questions. "That wasn't basic first aid. You treated her exactly like someone with advanced medical training would have. Airway management, bleeding control, hypothermia prevention. You did everything right." Before Vince could deflect again, a commotion in the hallway drew their attention. Officer Chen was being wheeled past on a gurney, awake now, and arguing with the nurse about wanting to go back to work. "I'm fine," Chen was saying. "I've had worse headaches from hangovers." "You have a concussion," the nurse replied firmly. "You're staying overnight for observation." Chen's eyes found Vince through the doorway, and she held up a hand to stop the gurney. You're the one who found me." Vince stood, uncomfortable with the attention, but unable to ignore the direct question in her voice. "Yes, the sheriff told me what you did. The radio call, the first aid, sending your dog for help." She paused, studying his face with the careful attention of someone trained to notice details. "That was quick thinking, professional thinking, just did what needed doing." "I'm Sarah Chen," she said, extending her hand, despite the IV tube taped to her wrist. "And I owe you my life." Vince shook her hand briefly, then stepped back. "Glad you're okay," but Chen wasn't finished. "I want to do something for you. Both of you," she added, glancing at Buck. "There has to be something." "We're fine," Vince said quickly. "Don't need anything." The lie was obvious to everyone in the hallway. Vince's clothes were patched and worn, his boots held together with duct tape. Buck's ribs showed despite his thick winter coat. They clearly needed many things. "At least let me buy you both dinner," Chen insisted. "It's the least I can do." Before Vince could refuse again, Dr. Martinez intervened. "Actually, that's not a bad idea. Mr. Murphy, when's the last time you had a hot meal? And your dog could use some looking after too." The attention was becoming overwhelming. Vince could feel more hospital staff beginning to notice the conversation, could sense the curiosity building. In another few minutes, there would be too many people, too many questions, too much focus on the life he had tried so hard to keep private. "We should go," he said, taking a step toward the door. "Wait," Chen called out. "At least tell me your name, your real name." Vince paused, one hand on Buck's collar. For 9 years, 8 months and 14 days, he had been nobody, just the homeless man with the dog. But looking at Chen's face, seeing the genuine gratitude there, he found himself saying words he hadn't spoken to anyone in years. "Vince Murphy." "Well, Vince Murphy," Chen said, "I'm going to find a way to repay you, whether you like it or not." As they walked back through the hospital corridors, Buck's nails clicking on the polished floor, Vince could feel something shifting in the careful balance of his life. For nearly a decade, he had survived by being invisible, by asking for nothing, and expecting less. But invisibility was a luxury he could no longer afford. Outside, the storm was beginning to clear, and the first stars were visible through the breaking clouds. Buck looked up at him with those intelligent brown eyes, as if asking what came next. "I don't know, boy," Vince said quietly. "I honestly don't know." But even as he spoke the words, he could feel the past stirring to life inside him, not the trauma and grief that had driven him to the woods, but the skills and knowledge and sense of purpose that had once defined who he was. For the first time in years, Vince Murphy was beginning to remember that he had been someone before he became no one. The question was whether Pine Ridge was ready to meet that person, and whether he was ready to be him again. By morning, news of the rescue had spread through Pine Ridge with the efficiency of small-town gossip. Vince discovered this when he and Buck made their usual trip to the dumpster behind Miller's grocery and found 3 people waiting for them, 2 with cameras, 1 with a notepad. "Mr. Murphy, Channel 7 News, could we get a quick interview about your heroic rescue last night?" Vince froze, Buck immediately sensing his distress and moving protectively between him and the strangers. The reporter, a young woman with perfect hair despite the early hour, stepped closer with her microphone extended. "Our viewers would love to hear how you saved Officer Chen's life. What was going through your mind when you found her bleeding?" "In the snow?" "No," Vince said simply, turning away from the camera. "Just a few questions." "I said no, but the damage was done." By the time Vince and Buck reached the hardware store, Tom Brennan was waiting with a cup of coffee and an expression Vince had never seen before, something between respect and curiosity. "Hell of a thing you did last night," Brennan said, offering the coffee. "Heard you saved that young officer's life." Vince accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping his weathered hands around the warm cup. "She's okay, far as I know. But these whole town's talking about it. About you." Brennan paused, studying Vince's face. "Some folks are saying you knew exactly what you were doing out there. Medical stuff, I mean." The coffee was good, real cream, not the powdered stuff, but Vince found it hard to swallow past the growing tightness in his throat. Lucky guess. Was it, though? Before Vince could answer, Buck's ears perked up, and he looked toward the street. A familiar patrol car was pulling into the parking space in front of the hardware store. Sheriff Coleman climbed out, followed by Officer Chen herself, who was supposed to be in the hospital for observation. "Thought I might find you here," Coleman said, approaching carefully. He had the look of a man who understood that Vince might bolt at any moment. Chen looked pale but determined, a white bandage visible beneath her regulation cap. "Dr. Martinez wasn't happy about me checking myself out, but I needed to find you." "You should be resting," Vince said. "I'll rest when I figure out who tried to kill me and why." Chen's voice carried the kind of steel that suggested arguing would be pointless. "But first, I want to talk to you, both of you," she added, glancing at Coleman. Brennan offered his office for privacy, and soon the 4 of them were crowded into the small space behind the hardware store's counter. Buck positioned himself at Vince's feet, alert but calm. "The thing is," Chen began, "what happened last night wasn't random. Someone was waiting for me on that road. Someone who knew my patrol route, knew I'd be alone." Coleman nodded grimly. "The tire tracks confirm it. 2 vehicles positioned to block the road. Professional setup. Which brings me to you," Chen said, focusing on Vince. "Your first aid wasn't just good, it was textbook perfect. Medical training recent enough that you remembered exactly what to do under pressure." Vince set down his coffee cup, his hands beginning to shake slightly. Buck sensed the change and pressed closer against his leg. "I don't know what you want me to say. I want you to tell me who you are," Chen said gently. "Really are. Because I think you're exactly the kind of person I need on my side right now." The room fell silent except for the distant sound of morning traffic and the hum of Brennan's space heater. Vince could feel 3 pairs of eyes watching him, waiting for an answer he wasn't sure he was ready to give. "I used to work in medicine," he said finally, "long time ago." "What kind of medicine?" Chen pressed. "Emergency, paramedic, EMT, some hospital work." Coleman leaned forward. "How long ago?" 10 years. Maybe 11. What happened? Chen asked. Why did you stop? And there it was. The question Vince had been dreading since the moment he decided to help Chen instead of walking away. The question that would unravel everything he had built around himself in the years since his world collapsed. My family died, he said simply. Car accident. After that I couldn't do the work anymore. The silence that followed was heavy with understanding. Chen and Coleman exchanged glances, both recognizing the weight of trauma that could drive someone away from everything they had known. I'm sorry, Chen said quietly. That must have been devastating. Vince nodded, not trusting himself to speak. But here's what I need you to understand, Chen continued. What I was investigating when I got attacked, it might be connected to accidents like that. Medical emergencies that weren't really emergencies. People dying who shouldn't have died. Something cold settled in Vince's stomach. What do you mean? I've been looking into a pattern of suspicious deaths over the past 15 years. People who died in accidents or from medical conditions that didn't quite add up. The paperwork always looked right. But when you dug deeper, Chen pulled out a manila folder from her jacket. 3 weeks ago, I started asking questions about the medical examiner's office, about certain ambulance crews, about response times that seemed deliberately slow. She opened the folder and spread several photographs across Brennan's desk. Vince found himself looking at accident scenes, medical reports, and newspaper clippings that made his hands start shaking again. Someone's been killing people and making it look like accidents or natural causes, Chen said, and I think I got too close to figuring out who. Coleman was studying Vince's face carefully. You recognize any of this? Vince's vision was beginning to tunnel. The photographs on the desk seemed to be moving, blurring together into a pattern of violence and deception that felt sickeningly familiar. I need some air, he said, standing abruptly. Buck was immediately on his feet, following as Vince pushed through the hardware store and out onto the sidewalk. The morning air was sharp and clean, but it did nothing to clear the fog of memory that was beginning to creep in around the edges of his mind. Chen followed him outside, leaving Coleman and Brennan to study the photographs. Vince, she said gently, I know this is hard, but if you know something, anything about this pattern, people's lives might depend on it. I don't know anything, Vince said, but his voice lacked conviction. Your family's accident, Chen said carefully. Tell me about it. Vince looked down at Buck, who was watching him with those intelligent brown eyes that seemed to understand everything. The dog had been with him through 3 winters, had shared his coldest nights and hungriest days, had never asked for anything except loyalty in return. They were coming to see me, Vince said quietly. Sarah and Emma, my wife and daughter. I was working a double shift at the hospital, and they were bringing me dinner. He paused, the words sticking in his throat like broken glass. The ambulance that responded to their accident, it took 47 minutes to get them to the hospital. 47 minutes for a trip that should have taken 12. By the time they arrived, they were both gone. Chen's face had gone very still. Who was the crew on that ambulance? I don't remember. After it happened, I wasn't thinking clearly about anything. But you would have known them. In a town this size, you would have worked with every EMT crew. Vince nodded slowly. Yeah, I would have known them. Chen pulled out her phone and showed him a photograph. 2 men in EMT uniforms standing beside an ambulance. Do you recognize either of these men? Vince stared at the screen, and 10 years of carefully constructed amnesia began to crumble. He knew those faces. He had worked with both of them, had trusted them with other people's lives, had considered them colleagues. That's Danny Morrison and Pete Kowalski, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. They're both dead now, Chen said quietly. Morrison died in a hunting accident 3 years ago. Kowalski had a heart attack last year, but Vince was no longer listening. He was remembering things he had forced himself to forget. Conversations that had seemed odd at the time, response times that didn't make sense, and a growing feeling that something was wrong in the department he had devoted his life to serving. Oh, God, he whispered. They didn't just let my family die. They made sure they died. The photograph fell from Vince's trembling hands, fluttering to the sidewalk, where Buck sniffed it cautiously. Chen bent to retrieve it, her movements careful and deliberate, as if she understood that Vince was balanced on the edge of something that could either heal or destroy him. "We need to go somewhere private," she said quietly. "Somewhere you feel safe." Coleman emerged from the hardware store, Brennan behind him. Both men took one look at Vince's face and understood that something fundamental had shifted in the past few minutes. "My camp," Vince said, his voice hoarse. "We can talk at my camp." The walk through the woods was conducted in silence, Buck leading the way with the confidence of someone who had made this journey countless times. Chen and Coleman followed, both struggling slightly with the uneven terrain and the snow that had drifted deep between the trees. Vince's shelter appeared gradually through the pines, first the blue tarp that served as a roof, then the carefully stacked firewood, then the whole modest structure that had been his home for nearly a decade. It was cleaner and more organized than either officer had expected, with a dignity that spoke to its builder's character. "Impressive," Coleman said, and meant it. Vince gestured for them to sit on the split-log benches he had arranged around a fire pit. He busied himself lighting a fire, his hands moving with the automatic precision of someone who had performed this ritual thousands of times. Buck settled beside him, offering silent comfort. "Tell me about your family," Chen said once. The fire was crackling steadily. For a long moment Vince stared into the flames. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of years of carefully buried grief. Sarah was a teacher, 3rd grade at Pine Ridge Elementary. She had this way of making every kid feel like they were her favorite. A small smile crossed his weathered face. Emma was 8, smart as a whip, wanted to be a doctor like her dad. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a worn leather wallet, extracting a photograph that had been folded and refolded so many times the creases had worn white. It showed a woman with gentle eyes and a girl with Vince's stubborn chin, both smiling at the camera with the easy happiness of people who believed the world was fundamentally good. Chen accepted the photograph with reverent care. "They're beautiful," Sarah made the best apple pie in 3 counties. Emma collected rocks, had this theory that each one had a story to tell if you knew how to listen. Vince's voice caught slightly. "They were coming to bring me dinner that night, homemade soup and fresh bread. Sarah always worried I wasn't eating enough during double shifts." Coleman leaned forward. "What do you remember about that night? The accident, I mean." Vince closed his eyes, and the memories came flooding back with painful clarity. "I was in the ER when the call came in. Multi-vehicle accident on Highway 12, about 6 miles out of town. When I heard the description, a blue Honda Civic, I knew. I just knew. What did you do?" "Tried to get someone to let me go to the scene, but protocol said family members couldn't respond to their own emergencies, so I waited and waited." His hands clenched into fists. 47 minutes, Chen. In all my years as an EMT, I never had a response time longer than 20 minutes, even in the worst weather. Chen was taking notes, her pen moving quickly across a small pad. "Who was on duty that night?" "Morrison. And Kowalski were first response. Jenkins and Martinez were backup." Vince paused, remembering. "But Jenkins was sick that night, and Martinez was covering another call, so it was just Morrison and Kowalski." "Did you know them well?" "Worked with them for 3 years. Danny Morrison was senior EMT, been doing it for 15 years. Good at his job, never saw him make a serious mistake. Pete Kowalski was newer, maybe 2 years on the job, but solid, reliable." Vince stood and walked to his makeshift storage area, returning with a small wooden box. Inside were the remnants of his former life, his EMT certification, a commendation letter, and beneath those newspaper clippings he had kept despite the pain they caused. This ran in the Pine Ridge Gazette 3 days after the funeral, he said, handing Chen a yellowed clipping. The headline read, "Local teacher and daughter die in highway accident." The article was brief, clinical in its description of how Sarah Murphy's car had skidded on black ice and collided with a semi-truck. It mentioned that emergency responders had worked heroically to save both victims, but their injuries were too severe. It doesn't mention the response time, Chen observed. No, and when I asked about it later, I was told there had been other emergencies that night, that the crew had done everything possible. Vince's voice turned bitter. I was grieving, not thinking clearly. I believed them. Coleman was studying the article. But you started having doubts. Not right away. The first few months I could barely function, took a leave of absence, then another. By the time I tried to come back to work, I couldn't handle it. Every call reminded me of that night, of how I couldn't save the two people who mattered most. Buck moved closer to Vince, sensing his distress. The dog's presence seemed to calm him slightly. When did you start wondering if something was wrong? Chen asked, about a year later. I was going through Sarah's things, trying to decide what to keep, and I found her appointment book. She had written down the time she was planning to leave. That night, 7:30. The accident happened at 8:45. Chen looked up from her notes. That's important. Why? Because the drive from our house to the hospital takes 20 minutes in good weather, 15 if you're in a hurry. She left at 7:30, which meant she should have been at the hospital by 7:50. But the accident didn't happen until 8:45. So, where was she for that extra hour? Coleman asked. That's what I started wondering. I drove the route myself, timed it. Dozens of times. There's nowhere she would have stopped, nothing that would have delayed her. Vince's voice grew quieter. Unless someone forced her to stop. The implications hung in the air around the campfire. Chen and Coleman exchanged glances, both understanding that they were looking at something much larger than a single corrupt medical examiner or a few bad EMTs. Did you ever confront Morrison or Kowalski about the response time? Chen asked. Tried to, but by then I wasn't exactly thinking rationally. I was drinking too much, sleeping too little, basically falling apart. When I started asking questions, people assumed it was grief talking. Morrison took me aside one day, told me I needed professional help, that I was developing conspiracy theories to avoid dealing with my loss. What did you do? Believed him. For a while. Vince stared into the fire. But the doubts never went away. Late at night, when I couldn't sleep, I'd think about that missing hour, about response times that didn't make sense, about how convenient it was that my family died just when I was starting to notice irregularities in our emergency response system. Chen leaned forward. What kind of irregularities? Response times that varied wildly with no apparent reason. Equipment failures that seemed to happen at exactly the wrong moments. Certain addresses where our response was always slower than average. Vince met her eyes. And patients who died, when they shouldn't have, from injuries that should have been survivable. Did you document any of this? Started to, but then the drinking got worse, and I lost my job, and eventually I lost everything else too. Ended up out here because I couldn't stand being around people who might have been part of whatever killed my family. Coleman was quiet for a long moment, studying Vince's face in the firelight. You think there was a deliberate conspiracy to let certain people die? I think, Vince said carefully, that someone in Pine Ridge has been playing God with people's lives for a very long time, and I think my family stumbled into something they shouldn't have seen. Chen closed her notebook and looked directly at Vince. Would you be willing to help me prove it? The question hung between them like a bridge across 10 years of pain and isolation. On one side was the safety of invisibility, the numbing comfort of existing without expectations or responsibilities. On the other side was the possibility of justice, of meaning, of becoming once again the man he had been before grief broke him. Buck looked up at Vince with those intelligent brown eyes, and for a moment it seemed as if the dog was asking the same question Chen had posed. What would that mean? Vince asked finally. It would mean stepping back into the world, Chen said honestly. It would mean people knowing who you are, asking questions about your past, probably a lot of attention. You won't want, and it would mean taking on some very dangerous people, Coleman added. If you're right about this conspiracy, they've already tried to kill Chen once. They won't hesitate to try again with any of us. Vince looked around his camp, at the shelter that had protected him through countless storms, at the fire pit, where he had cooked 1,000 meals, at the trees that had hidden him from a world that hurt too much to face. It had been a good life in its way, simple, safe, empty. My family deserves better than what they got, he said quietly. If there's a chance to find out what really happened to them, to make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else. He paused, gathering his courage. Then yes, I'll help. As if responding to his decision, Buck stood and moved to Chen's side, sniffing her hand, with the careful attention of a dog deciding whether to trust a new person. After a moment, he sat down beside her, offering his own form of acceptance. Good, Chen said, scratching behind Buck's ears, because I think we're going to need all the help we can get. 3 days later, Chen returned to Vince's camp with a cardboard box full of files and a laptop computer powered by a portable battery pack. Buck announced her arrival with a soft woof, not alarm, but acknowledgement that their temporary pack had gained a new member. I've been digging deeper into those suspicious deaths, she said without preamble, settling onto one of Vince's log benches. And I found something that's going to make you sick. Vince poured her coffee from the pot that always sat warming beside his fire. The ritual had become familiar over their past few meetings, Chen bringing information, Vince providing insight. From his years in emergency medicine, both of them slowly building a case that grew more horrifying with each revelation. How bad? Vince asked. Chen opened the laptop and angled the screen so he could see. Remember how we talked about your family's accident happening an hour later than it should have? Every day. I found the original dispatch records. Someone deleted them from the main system, but there are always backup copies. Her fingers moved across the keyboard, pulling up a document that made Vince's stomach lurch. The first call about your family's accident came in at 7:52 p.m., Chen said quietly. A trucker reported seeing a blue Honda stopped on the shoulder of Highway 12, hazard lights on. Vince stared at the screen, his coffee growing cold in his hands. But the official accident time was logged as 8:45, 53 minutes later. Chen scrolled down to show him more entries. There were 3 more calls during that time. A passing motorist, another trucker, and finally a state patrol officer who happened to be driving by. So people saw them. Multiple people saw them stopped on the side of the road. Gets worse. The state patrol officer's report says he stopped to check on them. Found Sarah conscious but disoriented, Emma unconscious but breathing. Both victims were alive and could have been saved with prompt medical attention. The words hit Vince like physical blows. Buck moved closer, pressing against, his leg with the solid warmth that had gotten him through countless dark nights. The patrol officer called for an ambulance at 8:02, Chen continued. Response time should have been 15 minutes, 20 at the outside, but Morrison and Kowalski didn't arrive until 8:47, 45 minutes during which your wife bled to death from injuries that Dr. Martinez says should have been completely survivable. Vince set down his coffee cup with shaking hands. Someone told them to wait. That's what I thought too. So I started looking at Morrison and Kowalski's other calls that month. Chen pulled up another document. Their response times were all over the map. Some calls, they arrived in under 10 minutes. Others took 40 minutes or more. What was the pattern? That's where it gets interesting. The delayed responses all involved specific families, the Hendersons who owned the land that the new shopping center is built on, the Kowalskis, no relation to Pete, who refused to sell their farm to a development company, the Yamadas, who were fighting a zoning change that would have allowed industrial development near the school. Vince felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. People who were standing in the way of development projects, exactly. And your family? Sarah was on the school board. She was leading the opposition to a proposal that would have closed Pine Ridge Elementary and consolidated with the county system. The memory came back with painful clarity. The development company needed that land for a new strip mall. Chen nodded grimly. Morrison and Kowalski weren't just corrupt EMTs. They were part of a network that eliminated obstacles to certain business interests. Who else was involved? Chen opened another file. Based on what I've been able to piece together, the network included the county medical examiner, at least. 3 EMT crews, someone in the sheriff's department, and several people in city planning and zoning. Current sheriff's department? Coleman's clean, I'm sure of that. But his predecessor, Sheriff Hayes, retired very comfortably to Florida about 5 years ago, bought a house worth 3 times his pension. Vince stood and walked to the edge of his camp, looking out through the trees toward the town that had been his home for most of his adult life. How many people died because of this? I've identified at least 15 suspicious deaths over the past 12 years. Probably more that I haven't found yet. Chen's voice was heavy with the weight of what she was discovering. Heart attacks that happened right after people received anonymous threats. Car accidents that occurred just before important vote. Medical. Emergencies where the response was delayed just long enough. And whoever's running this network tried to kill you when you got too close, which brings us to our current problem. Chen closed the laptop and faced Vince directly. I know who's behind this. At least, I know who's been running the operation for the past 5 years. Who? Dr. Richard Steele. He's the county medical examiner, but he's also on the board of directors for 3 different development companies. Every suspicious death I've traced has ended up on his examination table, and every death certificate he's signed has ruled the death natural or accidental. Vince knew the name. Steele had been working in the medical examiner's office when Vince was still an active EMT. Though he hadn't been the chief examiner then, a competent doctor with political ambitions and an expensive lifestyle that always seemed to exceed his government salary. How do we prove it? That's the problem. Steele's been very careful. All the official paperwork looks legitimate. The corruption is in what doesn't get documented. The phone calls, the delay responses, the evidence that gets overlooked, the witnesses who suddenly decide not to testify. Chen opened the cardboard box and pulled out a thick manila folder. But I think I found our smoking gun. 3 weeks ago, before someone tried to bash my skull in, I managed to get a copy of Morrison's personal financial records. She spread several bank statements across Vince's makeshift table. Look at this. Regular deposits, always for the same amount, always 2 days after one of the suspicious deaths. Vince studied the statements. The pattern was clear. $5,000 deposits that corresponded exactly with the dates Chen had identified as questionable emergency responses. Blood money, he said quietly. And it gets better. I traced the deposits back to their source. They came from a shell company called Mountain Vista Holdings. Never heard of it. Neither had I. But Mountain Vista Holdings is owned by another shell company, which is owned by another shell company, which is ultimately owned by Alpine Development Corporation. The name hit Vince like a punch to the gut. Alpine Development. They're the ones who wanted to buy the school property. Sarah was fighting them. And they're currently the biggest development company in the county. Hotels, shopping centers, residential subdivisions. They've been involved in every major development project for the past decade. Buck had moved to sit between Vince and Chen, his intelligent eyes moving back and forth as if following their conversation. The dog seemed to sense the growing tension, the feeling that they were closing in on something that would fight back viciously when cornered. There's more, Chen said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. I think Dr. Steele knows I'm still investigating. 2 nights ago, someone broke into my apartment. Nothing was stolen, but my files were searched. Did you report it? To who? If Steele has people in the sheriff's department, reporting it would just let him know how much I've discovered. Vince looked around his camp. the place that had sheltered him from a world that hurt too much to face. For nearly 10 years, these trees had hidden him from the consequences of caring about people, of getting involved in their problems and their pain. But sitting here with Chen and Buck, looking at the evidence of systematic murder disguised as natural death, he realized that hiding wasn't an option anymore. "What do you need from me?" he asked. "I need someone who understands emergency medicine, someone who can help me document exactly how these deaths should have been prevented. And I need someone they don't see coming, because I've been invisible for 10 years, because you're the one person in Pine Ridge who has nothing left to lose," Chen said gently. "They took everything from you already. That makes you dangerous." To them, as if summoned by their conversation, Buck's ears perked up and he turned toward the woods. A moment later, Vince heard what the dog had detected, the distant sound of vehicles approaching through the forest. "We've got company," Vince said, already moving to stamp out the fire. Chen grabbed her laptop and files, stuffing them back into the cardboard box with practiced efficiency. "How well do you know these woods?" "Better than anyone." Vince shouldered a pack that he kept ready for emergency evacuation. "Buck, come." As they melted into the tree line, Vince caught a glimpse of 2 black SUVs working their way up the barely visible trail toward his camp. Professional vehicles with tinted windows and the kind of aggressive presence that meant serious trouble. "Looks like Dr. Steele figured out we've been talking," Chen whispered. They moved deeper into the forest, Buck leading the way with the confidence of someone who had traveled these paths countless times in all weather and all seasons. Behind them, Vince could hear car doors slamming and voices calling his name, not the friendly voices of people who wanted to thank him for saving a life, but the hard voices of people who meant to silence him permanently. For the first time in a decade, Vince Murphy was running toward something instead of away from it, and for the first time since his family died, he had a reason to fight back. They spent 2 days moving through the wilderness, staying ahead of the search teams that seemed to know the forest almost as well as Vince did. On the second night, huddled in a cave Buck had discovered years earlier, Chen made a phone call that changed everything. "Dr. Martinez? It's Sarah Chen. I need you to meet me somewhere safe and bring everything you can find about the Murphy family accident from 10 years ago." Dr. Martinez arrived at the predetermined meeting spot, an abandoned ranger station 12 miles into the national forest, carrying a medical bag and a manila envelope thick with documents. "This is highly irregular," she said, but her tone suggested she understood the gravity of what Chen was investigating. "Did you bring the records?" "Everything I could find. But Sarah, what you're asking me to look for, if you're right about this, it changes everything I thought I knew about medicine in this county." They spread the documents across the ranger station's dusty table while Buck kept watch by the window. Vince found himself looking at his family's medical records for the first time since their deaths. Emergency room intake forms, treatment, notes, and the final heartbreaking documentation of their last hours. "Look at this," Dr. Martinez said, pointing to Sarah Murphy's intake form. "Severe blood loss from a severed femoral artery. But the injury itself was relatively clean. With proper pressure and immediate surgical intervention, this should have been completely survivable." Vince studied his wife's treatment notes, his medical training allowing him to read between the clinical language. The blood loss occurred over an extended period. If they had received proper first aid at the scene, she would have lived, Dr. Martinez finished. Both of them would have lived. Chen was examining Emma's records, an 8-year-old with a traumatic brain injury. The notes say she was conscious and responsive when the EMTs arrived. "But look at the timestamps," Dr. Martinez said, her voice growing angry. Emma was conscious and responding to verbal commands at 8:47 p.m. when Morrison and Kowalski arrived, but she didn't reach the hospital until 9:23 p.m. 36 minutes for a 12-minute drive, Vince said, his voice hollow, during which time a child with a brain injury was allowed to deteriorate without proper medical intervention. "Doctor, Martinez slammed the file closed. This isn't malpractice, this is murder. Chen opened her laptop and pulled up the financial records she had discovered. Dr. Martinez, I need you to look at something else. These are bank deposits made to Danny Morrison in the 2 years before he died. Dr. Martinez studied the screen, her expression growing more horrified with each entry. These dates, I remember some of these cases. Mrs. Henderson's heart attack, the Yamada family's carbon monoxide poisoning, the Kowalski farm accident. You treated them? Tried to, but in every case the patients arrived too late for effective treatment. I always wondered why the response times were so inconsistent. Chen scrolled to a different document. This is where it gets worse. Morrison wasn't the only one receiving payments. Look at this. A new list of bank accounts appeared on the screen, showing regular deposits to a dozen different names. Vince recognized most of them. EMT crews, dispatch operators, and administrative staff he had worked with for years. They weren't just delaying responses, Chen said. They were running a systematic operation to eliminate specific people while making it look like natural deaths. Dr. Martinez sat down heavily in one of the ranger station's old chairs. How many people died because of this? At least 15 that I can prove. Probably twice that number if we had access to all the records. Vince had been studying the list of names, and something was nagging at him, a memory from his last days as an active EMT that he had buried along with everything else from that time. Chen, he said slowly, what date did you say Morrison started receiving these payments? First deposit was March 15th, 12 years ago. That's 3 months after I reported concerns about response time irregularities to the medical director. Chen looked up from her laptop. You reported concerns. I was seeing patterns I couldn't explain. Equipment failures, communication problems, delays that didn't make sense. The memory was coming back now, painful but clear. I wrote a formal complaint and submitted it to Dr. Elizabeth Hartley. She was the medical director then. What happened to your complaint? Hartley scheduled a meeting to discuss it, but the meeting kept getting postponed, and then my family died, and Vince trailed off, the implication hitting him like a physical blow. Dr. Martinez was already pulling out her phone. Elizabeth Hartley retired about 8 years ago. Moved to Arizona, I think. Chen was typing furiously on her laptop. Mountain Vista Holdings made its first payment to Morrison 3 days after Vince filed his complaint. The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. Vince's family hadn't died because they were standing in the way of a development project. They had died because someone wanted to silence Vince before he could expose the corruption. He was beginning to uncover. They killed my family to shut me up, Vince said, his voice barely above a whisper. And it worked, Chen said gently. You disappeared, stopped asking questions, stopped being a threat to their operation. Buck moved from his position by the window to sit beside Vince, offering the comfort that had sustained them both through years of grief and isolation. But this time, instead of the familiar weight of helpless sorrow, Vince felt something else. Building in his chest, a cold, focused anger that had been buried for a decade. Dr. Martinez, he said, I need you to help me understand something. If someone wanted to eliminate people without arousing suspicion, how would they do it? You mean medically? I mean systematically. A network of people working together to cause deaths that look natural. Dr. Martinez considered the question with the careful attention of someone who understood that the answer might be used for justice rather than revenge. You'd need people in emergency services to delay responses, she said slowly. People in the medical examiner's office to classify deaths as natural, and you'd need someone with medical knowledge to identify the most effective methods. Someone like Dr. Steele. Richard's certainly qualified. He understands pathology, toxicology, and emergency medicine. If anyone could design a system like this, it would be him. Chen pulled up another document on her laptop. I've been tracking Dr. Steele's involvement with Alpine Development. He's not just on their board of directors, he owns a significant stake in the company. How significant? 30%, worth about $12 million based on their current projects. Vince stared at the screen, understanding finally dawning. This isn't about individual development projects. This is about controlling the entire economic development of the county. By eliminating anyone who stands in their way, Chen agreed. Environmental activists, property owners who won't sell, public officials who ask too many questions. Dr. Martinez was shaking her head in disbelief. But how did they choose their targets? How did they know who posed a threat? That's the question that's been bothering me, Chen said. The timing was always perfect. They seemed to know exactly when someone was about to cause problems for their projects. Vince was quiet for a long moment, thinking back to his years as an EMT, to the people he had worked with and trusted. A pattern was emerging from his memories, subtle but unmistakable once he knew what to look for. The monthly safety meetings, he said suddenly. What about them? We had mandatory safety meetings every month. All the EMT crews, dispatch operators, anyone involved in emergency services. The agenda was always the same: review recent calls, discuss problems, identify areas for improvement. Chen was following his logic, which means everyone in the network would know about every emergency response in the county, including response times, patient conditions, and medical outcomes. Vince felt sick as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. They were using our own quality improvement meetings to identify problems with their operation, and anyone who asked too many questions would be targeted for elimination. Dr. Martinez stood up abruptly. We have to stop this. If you're right, people are still dying. The question is how, Chen said. We have evidence, but it's mostly circumstantial. Bank records, suspicious patterns, but nothing that definitively proves murder. What would it take? Vince asked. We'd need direct evidence of the conspiracy. Records of the payments, documentation of the deliberate delays, or testimony from someone who was part of the network. Morrison and Kowalski are both dead, Dr. Martinez pointed out. But Dr. Steele isn't, Chen said. And neither are the other people on this list. Vince studied the names on Chen's screen, people he had worked with, people he had trusted with other people's lives. The betrayal cut deep, but beneath the pain was something else. A growing determination to make sure his family's deaths counted for something. There's something else, he said quietly. Something I haven't told you. Chen and Dr. Martinez both turned to look at him. The night Chen was attacked, that wasn't the first time someone tried to kill her. Chen's eyes widened. What do you mean? You said you'd been investigating the corruption for weeks before the attack, but someone's been watching you longer than that. Vince met her eyes. Buck and I weren't just randomly walking through the woods that night. We were following someone who had been stalking you. The silence that followed was broken only by the wind moving through the pine trees outside the ranger station. How long? Chen asked. 3 weeks, maybe a month. Buck started noticing the same vehicle parked near your apartment, the same person following you at a distance. I thought it was just paranoia at first, old habits from living off the grid. But the pattern was too consistent. Why didn't you say anything? Because I was still trying to be invisible. Getting involved meant stepping back into a world that had already taken everything from me. Vince paused, gathering his courage. But finding you that night, that wasn't coincidence. It was fate. Chen stared at him for a long moment, understanding, finally dawning. You saved my life twice, once by finding me in the snow, and once by watching over me before I even knew I was in danger. And now, Vince said, his voice carrying a strength that had been missing for 10 years. We're going to save a lot more lives by stopping these people once and for all. Outside the ranger station, Buck lifted his head and looked toward the forest, his ears pricked with attention. After a moment, he relaxed, but the brief alert reminded all of them that they were still being hunted, and that the final confrontation was coming whether they were ready for it or not. The plan came together over the next 48 hours, with Dr. Martinez serving as their connection to the outside world, while Vince and Chen remained hidden in the forest. The doctor returned to the hospital and her normal routine, But now she was gathering intelligence instead of simply treating patients. "Steele's getting nervous," she reported during their second meeting at the ranger station. "He's been asking questions about Chen's condition, whether she's experienced any memory loss from her head injury." "What did you tell him?" Chen asked. "That concussion patients often have gaps in their memory around the traumatic event. I may have suggested that you couldn't remember much about the night you were attacked." Vince was cleaning his emergency medical kit, reassembling supplies he had scattered across various hiding places over the years. His hands moved with the practiced efficiency of someone returning to a calling he had never truly abandoned. "How long do you think that will buy?" "Us?" he asked. "Not long. Steele's too smart to believe Chen isn't a threat just because she has memory issues. He's already been asking about the files from her apartment." Chen looked up from her laptop, where she had been documenting everything they had discovered. "Then we need to move faster than planned. The original strategy had been to gather more evidence before approaching federal authorities, but circumstances were forcing their hand. If Steele suspected that Chen's investigation was continuing, he would either accelerate his timeline or disappear entirely. "There's something else," Dr. Martinez continued. "I managed to access the personnel files for the EMT department. 3 of the people on your list, the ones receiving payments from Mountain Vista Holdings, are still active." She handed Chen a folder containing employment records and shift schedules. "If we're right about the ongoing conspiracy, they're still out there delaying responses for people who pose threats to Alpine development." Vince studied the names and faces of people he had once considered colleagues. "Any current targets?" "That's what worries me. There's a town council meeting tomorrow night about the proposed casino development. Several environmental groups are planning to speak against it." Chen was already pulling up information about the casino project on her laptop. "Alpine Development is the primary contractor. They stand to make about $50 million if the project goes through. And if the environmental opposition is effective, the project gets delayed indefinitely, maybe cancelled altogether." The implications were clear. If the conspiracy was still active, anyone who spoke effectively against the casino project would be at risk for an accident or medical emergency in the days following the council meeting. "We can't wait for federal authorities," Vince said. "If we're right, people are going to die tomorrow night or shortly after." Dr. Martinez nodded. "So what do we do?" Chen closed her laptop and looked directly at Vince. "We force Steele to expose himself, set up a situation where he has to act, then document everything he does." "That's extremely dangerous," Dr. Martinez pointed out. "If Steele realizes it's a trap, he'll try to kill us," Vince finished, "just like he tried to kill Chen, just like he killed my family." But for the first time in 10 years, the prospect of danger didn't make Vince want to run and hide. Instead, he felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that had once carried him through hundreds of emergency calls, the focused clarity that came from having a job to do and the skills to do it. "What did you have in mind?" he asked Chen. "We make ourselves visible. Let Steele know that I've recovered my memory and that I'm continuing the investigation. Force him to act while we're ready for him." "How do we get word to him without exposing ourselves?" Dr. Martinez raised her hand tentatively. "I might have an idea about that." She explained her plan while Vince continued organizing his medical supplies. The strategy was elegant in its simplicity. Dr. Martinez would let slip to Steele that Chen had been asking about her original case files, that her memory was returning, and that she suspected her attack was connected to the corruption investigation. "He'll have to respond," Chen said. "If he thinks I'm close to exposing the conspiracy, he can't afford to let me live." "Which brings us to the tactical problem," Vince said. "How do we document his response without getting killed in the process?" Buck raised his head from where he'd been dozing by the ranger station's cold fireplace. The dog's ears were pricked forward, and he was staring intently toward the forest. After a moment he relaxed, but the brief alert reminded them all that they were still being hunted. "We use the fact that they think I'm just a broken-down homeless man," Vince said. They've dismissed me for 10 years, even knowing I helped. Chen, they probably still see me as irrelevant. Chen was following his logic. But you're not irrelevant. You know their methods, you understand emergency medicine, and you've been invisible long enough to move around without being noticed. Exactly. While they're focused on eliminating you, I can position myself to document whatever they do. Doctor. Martinez looked troubled. That puts you directly in harm's way. I've been in harm's way for 10 years, Vince replied quietly. The difference is, now I have a reason to fight back. They spent the next several hours working out the details. Chen would return to Pine Ridge openly, making it clear that she was resuming her investigation. Dr. Martinez would provide medical backup and serve as their communications link. Vince would remain hidden but mobile, using his knowledge of the local terrain to stay ahead of any search teams while positioning himself to observe and record. The key is documentation, Chen emphasized. We need evidence that will hold up in court, recordings, photographs, something that directly connects Steele to the conspiracy. Vince had been thinking about this problem since their first conversation. What if we could get him to confess? How? By giving him something he wants more than your silence. Vince met Chen's eyes. Me. The plan that emerged was audacious and dangerous. Vince would reveal himself to Steele, claiming that Chen had convinced him to testify about the irregularities he had observed before his family's death. The prospect of a credible witness, someone with medical training who could speak authoritatively about the conspiracy, would force Steele to act decisively. He'll try to eliminate both of us, Chen pointed out, but he'll have to do it personally or with a very small team. Too many people involved increases the risk of exposure. Dr. Martinez was shaking her head. This is insane. You're basically offering yourselves as bait. Yes, Vince said simply, but it's bait with teeth. As they finalized their preparations, Vince found himself thinking about the journey that had brought him to this moment. 10 years ago, he had been a competent EMT with a loving family and a place in his community. The conspiracy had taken all of that away from him, had forced him into a decade of exile and grief. But the exile had taught him things he never would have learned otherwise. He understood survival in ways that few people did, could move through. Wilderness terrain with the confidence of someone who had made it his home. More importantly, he had learned to observe without being observed, to exist at the margins where important information often revealed itself. "There's one more thing," he said as they prepared to leave the ranger station. "Buck stays with Dr. Martinez." Chen looked surprised. "But he could be useful. He could also be killed. And he's done enough already." Vince knelt beside the dog, scratching behind his ears with the gentle attention that had become their daily ritual. "You've been a good partner, boy. The best partner anyone could ask for." Buck looked up at him with those intelligent brown eyes, and for a moment Vince saw understanding there, not just of the immediate situation, but of everything they had shared over the past 3 years. The cold nights when they had kept each other warm, the hungry days when they had shared what little food they could find, the gradual healing that had happened between a broken man and a loyal dog. "Take care of him," Vince told Dr. Martinez. "When this is over, we'll come back for him." "When this is over," Dr. Martinez corrected, "you're both coming back." But as they prepared to leave the safety of the ranger station for what would almost certainly be a final confrontation with the people who had destroyed his family, Vince wasn't thinking about survival. He was thinking about justice, not the abstract concept he had studied in EMT training, but the personal, immediate necessity of making sure that no other families suffered what his had endured. Chen was checking her recording equipment one final time, making sure the small digital devices were hidden but accessible. "Are you ready for this?" Vince shouldered his pack, now containing everything he would need for what was essentially a military operation conducted by 2 people against a conspiracy that had operated with impunity for more than a decade. "I've been ready for 10 years, he said. "I just didn't know it until now." As they walked away from the ranger station, heading back toward a town that had forgotten Vince existed and was about to remember him in the most dramatic way possible, Dr. Martinez called after them. "Vince! Chen, be careful, and remember, you're not just fighting for justice, you're fighting for the future of everyone in this county." Buck whined softly as they disappeared into the trees, and Dr. Martinez found herself hoping that when she saw them again, it would be in celebration rather than mourning. The final phase of their plan was simple in concept, but terrifying in execution. Chen would make herself visible in Pine Ridge, resuming her investigation openly and making it clear that she remembered everything about the night she was attacked. Word would reach Steele quickly, probably within hours, that his primary threat was back and more dangerous than ever. Meanwhile, Vince would position himself where he could observe and record whatever response Steele organized. The medical examiner would have to act quickly and decisively, which meant he would be more likely to make mistakes or reveal information that could be used against him. "The casino meeting is tomorrow night," Chen said as they made their way through the forest toward Pine Ridge. "If we're right about ongoing targets, Steele will be planning something for the environmental activists who speak against the project, which gives us a specific timeline and location to focus on. And if we're wrong?" Vince considered the question as they navigated a steep section of trail that Buck had taught him years earlier. "If we're wrong, we'll have announced ourselves for nothing and lost our best chance to gather evidence. And if we're right but the plan fails, then we'll be dead. But at least Dr. Martinez will have enough information to take to federal authorities." It wasn't much of a safety net, but it was better than letting the conspiracy continue indefinitely. How many more families would be destroyed while they waited for perfect evidence or ideal circumstances? As Pine Ridge came into view through the trees, its lights twinkling in the valley below like stars fallen to earth, Vince felt a complex mixture of emotions. Fear, certainly, because what they were about to attempt had a very high probability of ending with their deaths. But also relief, because after 10 years of running from his past, he was finally running towards something that mattered. One last thing, Chen said, as they prepared to separate for the final phase of their plan. "If something happens to me tomorrow night, nothing's going to happen to you. But if it does, make sure the story gets told. Make sure people know what really happened to your family and to all the others." Vince looked at her in the starlight, this young police officer who had stumbled into a conspiracy that should have destroyed her, but had instead revealed her strength and determination. "The story's going to get told," he said firmly, "but we're both going to be around to tell it ourselves." As they shook hands and headed toward their respective positions for the confrontation that would determine the future of Pine Ridge, neither of them noticed the figure watching from the trees, someone who had been tracking their movements with professional skill and was now reporting their location to people who had been waiting 10 years for another chance to eliminate Vince. Murphy permanently. The Pine Ridge Town Council met in the basement of the municipal building, a cramped space that smelled of old coffee and bureaucratic frustration. Chen arrived early, positioning herself in the back row where she could observe the crowd while staying close to the exits. The environmental activists were easy to identify, earnest, middle-aged couples with folders full of research, younger, people with handmade signs, and a few older residents whose families had lived in the area for generations. They were the kind of people who showed up to boring government meetings because they believed democracy worked if citizens participated. They were also, if Chen and Vince were right, walking into a death trap. Dr. Steele entered the meeting room at exactly 7 o'clock, taking a seat in the front row with the casual confidence of someone who belonged there. He was a distinguished-looking man in his 50s, with silver hair and the kind of expensive zoot that suggested his government salary was supplemented by other income. Chen activated the recording device hidden in her jacket and settled in to wait. Meanwhile, 3 blocks away, Vince was positioning himself in the abandoned building that had once housed Pine Ridge's first medical clinic. The structure gave him a clear view of the municipal building's parking lot and the surrounding streets. More importantly, it was connected to the town's old pneumatic tube system, a relic from the 1940s that had once carried documents between buildings, but now served as an unmonitored communication network for anyone who knew how to access it. The GPS tracker Chen had sewn into her jacket would allow Vince to follow her movements if she was taken from the meeting. But first, they needed to identify who was working with Steele and what method they planned to use for eliminating their targets. The meeting proceeded with the mind-numbing predictability of small-town government. Budget reports, zoning variances, and permit applications consumed the first hour while the environmental activists waited for their agenda item. Chen was beginning to wonder if they had misjudged the timeline when her phone buzzed with a text. Message from an unknown number. Officer Chen, this is Dr. Steele. Could you step outside for a moment? There's something I'd like to discuss privately. Her pulse quickened, but she forced herself to remain calm. This was exactly what they had hoped for, Steele making contact directly rather than waiting for a more subtle opportunity. She typed back, "I'll be right there." As Chen stood to leave, she noticed two men in the back of the room who hadn't been there when the meeting started. They were dressed casually, but stood with the rigid posture of ex-military, and both had positioned themselves near different exits. Outside, Dr. Steele was waiting by his expensive sedan, smoking a cigarette with the practiced air of someone who had given up trying to quit. "Officer Chen, I'm glad to see you've recovered from your accident." "It wasn't an accident." Steele smiled, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. "Of course not. Just as your family's death wasn't an accident, Mr. Murphy." Chen's blood turned to ice as she realized Steele wasn't talking to her. A moment later, Vince stepped out of the shadows beside the municipal building, his hands raised, but his posture suggesting he was far from surrendering. "Hello, Richard," Vince said calmly. "It's been a long time." "Not long enough, apparently. I thought we had convinced you to stay retired. You convinced me to hide. There's a difference." Chen could see that they had walked into exactly the trap. She and Vince had planned, but something felt wrong. Steele was too confident, too willing to reveal himself. Either he was more desperate than they had calculated, or he had a plan they hadn't anticipated. "The thing is," Steele continued, "your little investigation has become rather inconvenient. Chen here has been asking uncomfortable questions, and well, you're living proof that our previous solution wasn't permanent. So, you're going to try again." "Oh, I'm not going to try anything. My associates, however, have become quite concerned about the threat you pose to their business interests." As if summoned by his words, the two men from the meeting room emerged from the municipal building. But they weren't alone. Chen counted at least 4 other figures moving through the parking lot, all converging on their position with military precision. "You see," Steele said, dropping his cigarette and grinding it under his heel, "Alpine Development has invested too much money in this county to let a washed-up EMT and a small-town police officer interfere with their plans." Chen's hand moved toward her service weapon, but one of the approaching men called out, "I wouldn't do that, officer. We have weapons trained on both of you." Red laser dots appeared on Chen's chest and arms, at least 3 different sources. Probably more she couldn't see. Vince was similarly targeted, the dots moving across his torso like deadly Christmas lights. "Now," Steele said, his voice taking on the tone of someone conducting a business meeting, "we're going to take a little drive, somewhere more private where we can discuss your evidence, and who else might have access to it." "People know where we are," Chen said. "Dr. Martinez?" "Yes, I'm aware of her involvement. She'll be dealt with shortly." Steele smiled again. "One of the advantages of having people throughout the medical system is that accidents can happen anywhere, anytime." That was when Chen heard it, a sound so faint that anyone without experience in wilderness survival would have missed it entirely. The soft whistle that meant Buck was nearby. And where Buck was, Backup wouldn't be far behind. Vince heard it, too, and for the first time since stepping out of the shadows, he smiled. The thing about being homeless for 10 years, Richard, is that you learn to make friends in unlikely places. Before Steele could respond, the parking lot erupted in chaos. Spotlights blazed from multiple directions, and a voice amplified by a megaphone called out, "Federal agents, drop your weapons and put your hands where we can see them." The men with the laser sights were suddenly illuminated like actors on a stage, and Chen could see that they were surrounded by FBI agents in tactical gear. Dr. Martinez had apparently done more than just provide medical backup. She had contacted federal authorities and convinced them to take Chen's evidence seriously. But Steele was already moving, pulling a pistol from his jacket and grabbing Chen's arm. "Everyone stays back, or the officer dies." "Let her go, Richard," Vince said, stepping closer despite the gun pointed at Chen's head. "It's over. The FBI has all our evidence, all our recordings. Killing us now won't change anything." "Maybe not, but it will be satisfying." That was when Buck appeared, silent as a shadow, positioning himself behind Steele with the patience of a predator. The dog's intelligent brown eyes found Vince's, and a signal passed between them, the same wordless communication that had guided them through 3 years of survival in the wilderness. Vince whistled, a sharp, clear note that Buck had been trained to recognize as the signal for attack. The dog launched himself at Steele's gun hand with 40 pounds of muscle and determination. The weapon discharged harmlessly into the air as Steele stumbled backward, and Chen rolled away from the struggle. Federal agents swarmed the parking lot, arresting Steele's associates with the efficiency of people who had been planning this operation for hours rather than minutes. Dr. Martinez appeared at Chen's side, checking her for injuries with professional thoroughness. "Are you hurt?" she asked. "I'm fine. How did you—" "Vince gave me a phone number before you left the ranger station. Federal authorities who specialize in public corruption cases. It took some convincing. But when I showed them your evidence and explained the scope of the conspiracy, they agreed to provide backup." Chen looked around the parking lot, which was now flooded with federal agents and emergency vehicles. "Where's Vince?" She found him kneeling beside Buck, checking the dog for injuries from his collision with Steele. Both man and dog appeared, unharmed, but there was something different about Vince's posture, a sense of completion, as if a weight he had carried for 10 years was finally lifting from his shoulders. "It's over, boy," he said quietly, scratching behind Buck's ears. "We got them. We finally got them all." As federal agents led Dr. Steele away in handcuffs, Chen heard him shouting over his shoulder, "You have no idea how deep this goes. Alpine development is just the beginning." But Chen wasn't listening to Steele's threats. She was watching Vince Murphy, no longer the invisible homeless man who had saved her life in the snow, but a person reclaiming his place in the world after a decade of exile. The investigation would continue for months, unraveling a conspiracy that reached far beyond Pine Ridge and had cost dozens of lives over more than a decade. But for tonight, in a municipal parking lot flooded with spotlights and federal agents, justice had finally caught up with the people who thought they could murder with impunity. And somewhere in the chaos, Dr. Martinez was already making plans to help Vince and Buck transition back to the world they had been forced to leave, not as refugees this time, but as heroes coming home. The FBI field office in Helena was a far cry from the wilderness where Vince had spent the last decade, but he found himself surprisingly comfortable in the sterile conference room, where federal agents were documenting everything he could remember about the Pine Ridge emergency medical system. Agent Sarah Williams was a methodical woman in her 40s, who specialized in public corruption cases. She had been taking Vince's statement for 3 hours, and her legal pad was covered with notes that would help build cases against a dozen conspirators. "Let's go back to the safety meetings you mentioned," she said. "You're certain that all EMT crews were required to attend?" "Every month, first Tuesday. Dr. Hartley, she was the medical director then, made it clear that attendance wasn't optional. Chen sat beside him, occasionally adding details from her own investigation. Buck lay at Vince's feet, wearing a new collar that identified him as a working therapy dog, a designation Dr. Martinez had arranged through the hospital's volunteer program. And these meetings included detailed discussions of response times and patient outcomes. Everything. We reviewed every call from the previous month, talked about what went right and what could be improved. Anyone who wanted to identify patterns in our emergency responses would have had access to perfect information. Agent Williams made another note, which explains how Dr. Steele and his associates could identify potential problems and eliminate them before they became serious threats. The scope of the conspiracy was still being unraveled, but early estimates suggested that at least 23 people had died over 15 years because emergency medical responses had been deliberately delayed or compromised. The financial motive was staggering. Alpine Development had profited by more than $200 million from projects that became possible only after key opponents were eliminated. Mr. Murphy, Agent Williams continued, I want you to understand how important your testimony is going to be. You're the only credible witness who can speak to the systematic nature of this conspiracy. What about the other EMTs who were involved? 3 are cooperating in exchange for reduced sentences. 2 others have hired lawyers and aren't talking. But your testimony as someone who observed the irregularities before becoming a victim yourself, that's going to be crucial for establishing the full scope of what happened. Chen leaned forward. What about Dr. Steele? Is he talking? Dr. Steele is maintaining his innocence and claiming that any irregularities were the result of individual bad actors rather than systematic corruption. Agent Williams smiled grimly. But we found his personal financial records yesterday. Offshore accounts, real estate investments, cash deposits that correlate exactly with the timeline of suspicious deaths. How much money are we talking about? Conservative estimate? About $15 million over 12 years. Vince felt a familiar surge of anger, not the helpless rage that had driven him into the wilderness, but the focused determination that had carried him through 3 days of federal interviews. His family had died so that Richard Steele could afford a more expensive lifestyle. There's something else, Agent Williams said, consulting a different file. We've identified similar patterns in 3 other counties. This wasn't just a Pine Ridge operation. It was part of a regional network that may have been responsible for more than 60 deaths. The number hit Vince like a physical blow. 60 families destroyed, 60 sets of children who would grow up without parents, 60 communities diminished by the loss of people who had been eliminated because they stood in the way of corporate profits. How long will the trials take? Chen asked. Realistically, 2 to 3 years for all the related cases. But the important prosecutions, Steele and the Alpine Development executives, those should begin within 6 months. Buck raised his head and looked toward the conference room door. A moment later, Dr. Martinez appeared, carrying a manila envelope and wearing the expression of someone who had important news to share. I hope I'm not interrupting, she said, but I thought you'd want to see this immediately. She handed the envelope to Vince. Inside were legal documents that he recognized as property deeds and insurance papers, but not just any property. These were the documents for his family's home, the place where he had lived with Sarah and Emma before the accident destroyed his world. I don't understand, Vince said. The house has been sitting empty for 10 years, Dr. Martinez explained. The insurance company has been paying the property taxes, waiting for you to claim it. When I contacted them and explained the situation, they were eager to transfer ownership back to you. Vince stared at the deed, seeing his own name printed in official legal text. For a decade, he had assumed that everything from his previous life was gone forever. that the house where his family had lived and loved had been sold to pay debts or claimed by the county for unpaid taxes. The insurance settlement from your family's deaths, Dr. Martinez continued gently. It's been sitting in an account collecting interest, along with your pension fund and the disability benefits you were entitled to but never claimed. Agent Williams was looking at the documents with professional interest. How much money are we talking about? Enough for Mr. Murphy to start over, comfortably, if that's what he chooses to do. But Vince wasn't thinking about money. He was thinking about walking through rooms where Sarah had hummed while cooking breakfast, where Emma had insisted on reading bedtime stories to her stuffed animals, where 3 people had been a family before random violence destroyed everything they had built together. I can't go back there, he said quietly. You don't have to, Chen said, understanding immediately. But you could, if you wanted to. That's the difference. For 10 years, Vince had survived by accepting that he had no choices, no options except to endure whatever each day brought. The idea that he could choose his future, that he had resources and possibilities beyond simple survival, was almost overwhelming. Buck stood and moved to sit beside Vince's chair, offering the steady comfort that had sustained them both through the worst years. But now, instead of comfort in the face of hopelessness, the dog seemed to be offering encouragement for whatever came next. There's one more thing, Dr. Martinez said. The hospital board met yesterday. They voted unanimously to offer you a position as Director of Emergency Medical Training. Full salary, benefits, and the opportunity to make sure that what happened to your family never happens to anyone else. Vince looked around the conference room at Agent Williams, who was building cases that would send corrupt officials to prison, at Chen, who had risked her life to uncover the truth, at Dr. Martinez, who had provided the medical expertise and federal connections that made justice possible, and at Buck, who had been his partner through the darkest years and was ready to be his partner in whatever came next. Director of Emergency Medical Training, he repeated. You'd be responsible for training new EMTs, developing response protocols, and overseeing quality assurance for the entire county system. Basically, you'd be in charge of making sure emergency medical services actually served the people who need them. It was, Vince realized, exactly the job he would have designed for himself if he had been allowed to dream about returning to medicine. A chance to use everything he had learned, both from his formal training and from 10 years of surviving against impossible odds, to help other people and prevent future tragedies. When would I start? He asked. Dr. Martinez smiled. Whenever you're ready, the position will wait for you as long as necessary. Agent Williams was gathering her files, preparing to continue the investigation that would occupy her for months to come. Mr. Murphy, you should know that your cooperation has already prevented additional deaths. We identified 3 people who were being targeted for elimination, and they're now under federal protection. 3 people who get to go home to their families tonight because you had the courage to step forward, Chen added. As they prepared to leave the federal building, Vince found himself thinking about the journey that had brought him to this moment. 10 years ago, he had been a man with a family, a career, and a place in his community. The conspiracy had taken all of that away, had forced him into exile and despair, but the exile had also given him things he never would have gained otherwise: resilience, self-reliance, and a bone-deep understanding of what mattered most in life. He had learned to survive with nothing, which meant he could thrive with anything. More importantly, he had learned the difference between existing and living. For 10 years, he had existed in the margins, waiting for each day to end. Now, for the first time since his family died, he had the possibility of truly living again. Chen, he said as they walked toward the parking garage, I want you to know that saving your life that night, that was the beginning of saving my own life too. We saved each other, she replied. That's what partners do. And as they walked into the Montana sunlight, with Buck trotting contentedly between them, Vince Murphy began to believe that he might actually have a future worth living for. 6 months. Later, Vince stood in the conference room of Pine Ridge General Hospital, watching a class of 12 new EMT trainees practice emergency response procedures. Buck lay in the corner, wearing his therapy dog vest and keeping a careful eye on everyone in the room. "Remember," Vince told his students, "your response time can mean the difference between someone going home to their family or never seeing them again. Every second matters, but so does every decision you make along the way." One of the trainees, a young woman named Jessica, raised her hand. "Mr. Murphy, what if we encounter a situation where we're pressured to delay our response?" The question brought a small smile to Vince's weathered face. 6 months ago, such a question would have been unthinkable in Pine Ridge. The idea that EMTs might face pressure to compromise their medical judgment would have seemed paranoid. But the trials of Dr. Steele and his associates had educated the entire community about the importance of medical independence. "Good question," Vince said. "If anyone, and I mean anyone, tries to influence your medical decisions for non-medical reasons, you document everything and report it immediately. The lives you save might include your own." After class, Vince walked across the hospital parking lot to the small apartment he had been renting since returning to town. It wasn't the house where he had lived with Sarah and Emma. He had donated that property to the county for use as a family counseling center, but it was comfortable, and more importantly, it was home. Chen was waiting for him on the front steps, still wearing her police uniform, but with lieutenant's bars now adorning her collar. Her promotion had come through 2 weeks after Dr. Steele's conviction, recognition of her role in exposing the conspiracy that had terrorized Pine Ridge for more than a decade. "How were the new recruits today?" she asked. "Eager, smart. They asked better questions than I used to when I was their age. That's because they're learning from someone who's seen what happens when the system fails." They walked together toward downtown Pine Ridge, Buck trailing contentedly behind them. The town looked much the same as it had when Vince was living in the woods, but there were subtle changes that spoke to a community that had confronted its own capacity for blindness and chosen to see more clearly. The Pine Ridge Gazette now ran a weekly column about local government meetings, ensuring that citizens knew what decisions were being made in their name. The town council had passed new ordinances requiring transparency in all development projects. Most importantly, a memorial garden had been established in the town square, honoring the 23 people who had died because a few individuals valued profit over human life. "The federal prosecutors called this morning," Chen said. "They're confident that Alpine Development's executives will receive maximum sentences." "How long?" 25 years minimum. Longer if they can prove direct involvement in ordering the murders." Vince nodded, feeling the complicated satisfaction that came with justice delayed but not denied. No prison sentence would bring back Sarah and Emma, but knowing that other families would be protected from similar violence provided a form of peace he had thought impossible. They stopped at the memorial garden, where 23 oak trees had been planted in a spiral pattern around a central fountain. Each tree bore a small plaque with a name and dates, simple acknowledgments of lives that had been cut short by greed. Vince found the tree for Sarah Murphy, age 34, beloved, teacher and mother. Beside it stood the tree for Emma Murphy, age 8, whose favorite hobby had been collecting rocks that told stories. "I brought them something," Chen said, pulling a small wrapped package from her jacket. Inside was a smooth river stone painted with tiny flowers, Emma's favorites, and a small apple representing Sarah's legendary pies. Chen placed them at the base of the trees with the reverence of someone who understood that some losses could never be fully healed, only honored. "They would have been proud of what you did," Chen said quietly. "They would have been proud that we all did it together," Vince corrected. "Sarah always said that the most important problems required the most people to solve them." As they stood in the memorial garden, other residents of Pine Ridge passed by, some stopping to acknowledge Vince with nods or quiet greetings, others simply walking past with the comfortable acceptance of neighbors who had learned to see each other more clearly. Tom Brennan emerged from his hardware store and approached them, carrying a manila envelope and wearing the expression of someone with important news to share. "Vince, I thought you'd want to see this," he said, handing over the envelope. Inside was a letter from the National Emergency Medical Services Association, informing Vince that he had been selected to receive their annual award for outstanding service to emergency medicine. The ceremony would be held in Washington, D.C., and would include recognition of his role in exposing systemic corruption that had endangered public safety across multiple states. "National recognition," Chen said, reading over his shoulder. "You're going to be famous. I'm going to be useful," Vince corrected. "There's a difference." But he was pleased by the recognition, not for personal reasons, but because it would give him a platform to advocate for reforms that could prevent similar conspiracies in other communities. The conspiracy in Pine Ridge hadn't been unique. It had been a template that corrupt officials could follow anywhere, that oversight was weak and citizens weren't paying attention. As the sun began to set behind the mountains that surrounded Pine Ridge, Vince felt the deep satisfaction that came from work that mattered. His EMT training program was being replicated in other counties. The reforms he had helped design were being implemented statewide. Most importantly, young people like Jessica were learning that their oath to do no harm sometimes required the courage to stand up to people who wielded significant power. "What's next?" Chen asked as they prepared to head home. "Tomorrow I start training a new class of paramedics. Next week I'm testifying before the state legislature about medical independence legislation. Next month Buck and I are visiting colleges to talk about careers in emergency medicine. And next year," Vince looked around the memorial garden at the trees that would grow larger each year in memory of people who had died too soon. Then at the town that had learned to see its most vulnerable residents as fully human. "Next year, we make sure this never happens again, anywhere." As they walked home through the gathering dusk, Buck trotting ahead to investigate interesting scents, Vince found himself thinking about the unexpected paths that had led him to this moment. 10 years ago, he had lost everything that mattered to him. 5 years ago, he had been invisible and hopeless, surviving but not living. But sometimes the most broken places were where the most important healing happened. Sometimes the people who had lost everything were the ones who could see most clearly what needed to be protected. And sometimes a homeless man and his loyal dog could save not just one life, but an entire community's capacity for justice and compassion. In the distance, the lights of Pine Ridge twinkled like earthbound stars, and for the first time in more than a decade, Vince Murphy looked toward the future with hope, instead of merely enduring the present with resignation. He had come home, not to the life he had lost, but to the life he had chosen to build from the wisdom that comes only through surviving the unthinkable and choosing to help others do the same. Buck looked back at him with those intelligent brown eyes that had seen him through the darkest years, and Vince could swear the dog was smiling. Tomorrow would bring new students to train, new reforms to implement, and new opportunities to ensure that emergency medical services actually served the people who needed them most. Tonight, though, was for gratitude, for second chances, for the kindness of strangers who became family, and for the ripples of compassion that could transform an entire community when one person decided that invisible didn't have to mean powerless. The memorial garden would grow with each passing season, a living reminder that every life had value and that some losses could be transformed into lasting change. The oak trees would stand for generations, their roots growing deeper each year, their branches reaching toward light that would never again be dimmed by those who confused profit with progress. And somewhere in the gathering darkness, a man who had once been forgotten was walking home with his partner and his friend, carrying the quiet satisfaction of work that honored the dead by protecting the living. Vince Murphy had found his way back to the world, and the world was better for having him in it.